The next session that we're hosting for you is Driving Innovation Through Diversity, using diversity as the key to success on a global scale. And I'm going to leave this session in the very capable hands of Emily Nott, Lead for Diversity and Inclusion at Innovate UK.
Hi everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to be here moderating this session. And to see diversity and inclusion being such a key priority at the EUREKA Global Innovation Summit. We are focusing on this in several ways. We had a session yesterday with the leaders of the innovation agencies to talk about this topic, talk about the role of innovation agencies in promoting diversity and inclusion, and talk about some opportunities for collaboration. We've got this discussion session now, and also we've got an innovation lab where it's going to be a really interactive discussion with delegates, helping us to work out where as innovation agencies we should be focusing our efforts going forward. It is such a fantastic opportunity at the summit with so many businesses, research organisations and innovation agencies from around the world to be talking about this and to have it so high on the agenda. A really, really important agenda, but also a huge economic global opportunity. So at Innovate UK, the UK's innovation agency, we are fully committed to promoting diversity and inclusion in the work that we do. And it's really important to us in three main areas. So we believe firmly that a great idea for innovation can come from anybody. So if we want to address the global challenges of today and the future, we need to tap into the full talent for innovation that's available to us. Secondly, we know that diversity within businesses is good for business. Diverse businesses understand their customers, they understand their markets better, and there's some great evidence now to show that diversity contributes to financial success and value creation within companies. And then lastly, as innovation agencies, a lot of what we do is about helping companies make the right connections, develop new collaborations. And again, if we can promote diversity and inclusion there, that should lead to stronger outcomes. So thinking about this session today, this panel discussion, what I'm really hoping to do is to get everybody in the room thinking about diversity and inclusion a bit more seriously, a bit more closely, thinking about how directly this will have an impact on you and your organisations going forward, and really what are the opportunities for you. That's all I wanted to say as a brief intro, and I'd like to now invite the panel up on stage, please. Okay, so I would describe this panel as advocates for diversity and inclusion, and some of them are quite outspoken advocates as well, so we'll find that out. And these people are doers, so they are actually themselves taking action to make positive difference and make change in this area. So I will just quickly introduce the panel. So starting to my left here, we have Karen Salt. And Karen is the director of the Centre in Research in Race and Rights at the University of Nottingham and deputy chair of the UKRI External Advisory Board for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. We then have Laura Haynes from UN Women UK. We then have Galit Desheh, who is from Israel. So we're lucky to have Galit here, because if you don't know, it's Eurovision week this week in Israel, so there's lots of buzz in Israel about that. So Galit is from Power of Diversity in Israel. Then we have Tim Vorley. So Tim is Professor of Entrepreneurship from Sheffield University, and he also leads something called the Innovation Caucus, which I'm sure he'll tell you all about. We then have Priya Guha, who is a venture partner at Merian Ventures, and she's also a member of the Innovate UK Council. And then last but by no means least, we have Hardeep, who is Chief Executive of Kaleidoscope Investments. So I've got some questions that I'd like to talk through with the panel, but there's also an opportunity for people in the audience to pose some questions using Slido. So I think it's slido.com, hashtag Aegis 2019. So please do put forward your questions as we go through, and we'll pick up on those as they come in. Okay, so really just to start with, I'd like to ask the panel about what do you think of when you think of diversity and inclusion? What does it mean to you? And why is this agenda so important to you? When did you decide to start working on this? And so I'd just maybe I'll start with Hardeep on the end on this one.
Thanks for that, Emily. Well, my life changed significantly in 2006 when my son was born with a severe disability, and that was the first time that I ever really considered diversity in important disabilities. So Kaleidoscope has spent the last 4 years researching the disabled marketplace, in particular for entrepreneurship, to find people with disabilities that would like to start their own businesses. And given that my background was investments, mentoring, helping startups, I thought it was the best use of my sort of background and focus. And it's been remarkable. You know, I've met over 800 people in the last 4 years, all with disabilities. And, you know, I think the biggest lesson I've learned is just never judge a book by its cover. Some of the stories I can share about how people with disabilities have been able to achieve is staggering. So in answer to your question, I think disability is absolutely critical on anyone's agenda, and there are no exceptions to the rule.
Okay, thank you. Laura?
Well, at UN Women, part of our job is to change the world, okay? So that's what we're trying to do. And we realized quite a while ago that that was not going to happen until we addressed the challenges of everyone and began to include the brains, the creativity, the thinking, the opportunities of a much broader cross-section of people. And everyone knows the quote about if you keep doing the same thing the same way and expect difference, it's not going to happen. Well, I would argue if you keep doing the same thing the same way with the same people or the same type of people, we're not going to solve some of the larger problems that we have. Everyone has heard about the Sustainable Development Goals and the kind of commitments that we've made, and commitments with a deadline. We've said 2030. And what we've said is, actually, we need an earthquake. We need to create change at such a level and start to address things differently. And we can only do that by engaging a broader cross-section of people. And we can only do that by putting the tools of change into the hands of people all over the world. So how long have we been thinking about this? Forever. Why is it important? Because we have to make changes, and we can only do that by including the great brains from around the world.
Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, if I could add in, I think as a black female-identified individual, it's kind of hard for me to sort of go, I had this epiphany yesterday. You know, walking into various spaces and rooms, I'm often quite confronted by the type of difference and what that essentially means, whether or not that's in Whitehall, whether or not that's walking through airports. I'm fascinated often by the staff that works at airports and the ones who are on the front line who might be flight attendants. But that works in the same at the university or other places, and it's really quite interesting that it's not necessarily just do I see myself represented in senior management or on boards, but it's also how are people treated? What's the types of interactions that happen amongst different sets of people? What's communicated to folks that sort of say, we will allow you to be in this space, but we won't actually allow you to lead in this space? This has been a kind of individual mission for me for a long time, but from a research perspective, and also somebody actively involved in the research and innovation sector, I'm really committed to coming up with rigorous evidence-based tools and approaches that can allow anybody to pick this up. You don't have to have had the epiphany one day to do it. It just becomes normal practice. The same way you do anything else that you would do in your job, it becomes a way to fold it in without people feeling uncomfortable or unsure or tentative or ticking a box that looks like the diversity matrix, you know, and you squeeze that in. And I think the more we join up and work together across multiple sectors, the more we can actually build the sort of worlds that we want to live in, the ones that are creative, the ones that are innovative, and the ones that actually use every single resource and talent to the utmost, and because that's the type of future we need to be in.
Emily, if I can add in the context of the innovation space, I think, for me, the reason to why is because if we don't achieve diversity and inclusion in the context of innovation, we're going to miss out on two really important things. One, as Laura was saying earlier, is the creativity that comes from bringing diverse groups and perspectives to the table, which is absolutely crucial to the future of innovation to address all of the issues that we face today. But secondly, and I think this is very relevant to some of the business audience that will be in this room, because it actually makes better business sense. Yeah. Many people will be familiar with McKinsey's work on this space, but for those who might not have come across it, if you look at, they looked at specifically gender diversity and BAME diversity, but if you have a gender diverse board, the average returns are 21% greater. If you have a BAME diverse board, that's 33% greater. So this is a no-brainer for business. If you want your business to succeed, you should be ensuring that you have a diverse view of opinions at the table, and those opinions are heard and included.
Yeah, and I think actually McKinsey research showed also that companies that didn't have diversity, there was a penalty. So companies with the least diversity at those very senior levels were 29% more likely to underperform financially. So, yeah, it's massive. Okay, brilliant. So how do we go about, you're all advocates for this agenda, but not everybody is. And as you said, we want this to be mainstream, just normal behavior, thinking about this all the time. How do you convince people that this is important to them, it's relevant to them across all areas of innovation? So, Galit, I'd like to bring you in here and talk from your experience here.
I'd like to say just a few words about power and diversity.
Yes,
So Power and Diversity was established 2 years ago by a group of venture capitalists. It's led, and the visionary is a man called Alan Feld, is the founder and managing partner of Vintage VC. It's a fund of funds, almost $2 billion Israeli-based fund of funds. And I have to say that when Power and Diversity started, it started for two main reasons. One was the social reason. We wanted to change the face of the industry in Israel and include the 7 groups counted in Israel as the ones who are not there in the startup industry. And second, as in the UK and America, etc., we have a very problematic shortage of people power, tech people power, and which is actually hurting the industry very badly. And the main thought was that we will bring, when they established Power and Diversity, they thought that we'll bring diversified people in, the companies will have more people power, and boom, and we have success. And of course, it doesn't work that way. So the introduction is just to explain, I work with different types of companies, but when I work with startups, I think that's the most difficult one, because startups start their day running 250 miles an hour and then increase their speed. And they are living on other people's money. In Israel, every second person is a tech entrepreneur these days. And most of them come from the same breeding pool, went to the same tech classes, served in the army in very specific. Basically, they're all young, white men. And you compete with your own peers on developing the same inventions. So convincing them that diversity and inclusion will actually work in their benefit is a huge challenge.
So how do you do it?
Well, first of all, we don't start with talking about the social importance, and we don't speak about the shortage of employees, because even if they have a huge shortage and they want those people to come in, they have no idea how to do that, and usually they'll see them and think that they're incapable. Mm-hmm. So we convince them, we work on the business sense and how innovation, ingenuity is important for developing their skills, their approaching other markets, and basically their product, and how you solve problems faster. You develop a better product. You can view the next product But you can't do that on a vision and desire alone. So we developed a 6-month program that will take them through the process as painless as possible. And this is a very big issue with startups.
And have you got lots of success stories as a result of that work? Is that available information for people to go and
I think we do have some success stories. I'll be very, very careful because measuring success in the startup world is, changes by the minute. But you see that when you start talking about diversity and inclusion within the company, before you bring other people in, you see that the way they communicate with each other changes. And they manage to view other types of leadership as reasonable or even successful. This is amazing because usually all they see is themselves. We have we actually measured diverse teams versus homogeneous teams, and we see that when you run them properly, the rate of success is higher, and the number of problems they solve is higher. So, yes.
Great, okay.
To pick up on a couple of the things that have been said, so Emily mentioned that I'm from something called the Innovation Caucus, which is a network of academics looking into this, and we're currently working with Innovate UK to really try and understand the diversity and inclusion agenda a bit more. Karen mentioned the need for research in this and the need for evidence. If we're going to create change, innovation agencies are crucial in this kind of landscape. So we've been conducting a global review looking at what different innovation agencies have been doing in this space to try and understand really kind of what's going on, get a map of the ecosystem and what's happening. I think the next really important step in that is actually beginning to kind of use data and evidence much more effectively.
Yeah.
Trying to kind of ensure that we're doing what works for the communities that we're trying to engage. If they're underrepresented, we need to be able to talk to these underrepresented groups in a way that they can relate to. So some of the work that we've been doing has actually been going out and talking to innovators and aspirational innovators that are part of that BAME group or part of kind of the disabled entrepreneur innovator cohort to try and see why some of the innovation agency programs aren't working for them.
Yeah.
And we recognize from that what we're beginning to see is that we do need a targeted approach, but we also need to make sure that we're embedding a lot of these activities into the kind of core agendas and activities. And I think that we don't know enough. I'm going to say that. I'm an academic, I'm a researcher, but we need to know more, and we need to be able to use that evidence to really understand what works and what we can improve.
Yeah. Okay. And the global review that Tim just mentioned there, we found from that actually, we looked at 10 different countries, and we found that there's quite a lot going on that's focused on gender. And it appeared to be some really good work in that area. But are we focusing too much on gender? What about other underrepresented groups? What are we doing for them? And what's the message really for innovation agencies to be thinking about on that topic and businesses in the room? Hardeep, do you want to?
I would certainly never say we're focusing too much on gender because I don't think we can ever focus too much on any particular diverse group. But I think with disability, it is the underrepresented or the underhanded brother. A lot of the people with disabilities refer to it like that. And I think there is so much that still needs to be done with disability. I think from the world of entrepreneurship, it virtually doesn't exist. With my business partner, Shane Bratby, he founded Disabled Entrepreneurs. And this is the first website in the UK that helps disabled people to start their own businesses. And his issue for me was people with disabilities are considered to be charity cases when it comes to investment. So go get a grant, enter this competition, but actually investable, no. And that's the biggest challenge they face. And actually, coming from the city, having all the connections that I've got, I struggle to raise money for it in the first place. So I think there's a huge mindset change that needs to be adapted. And it is this thing about judgment. And there are a number of things in the UK that have happened in the last year that I think are actually very positive. If you watch Britain's Got Talent, a guy with cerebral palsy actually won it. There are supermarkets now that have special opening hours for people with autism or other types of disabilities. The government is trying to encourage initiatives to encourage entrepreneurship. entrepreneurship amongst disabled people. I think role models are critical. We've spoken about that earlier.
Yeah.
There's a company in Germany called Autocon that only hires people with autism, and it's in the technology space.
Yeah.
So it's actually finding a niche within a disability and proving, as you said earlier, to the business community, that actually that can help you to be commercial as well. It's not about feeling sorry for a disabled person and that's why you help them. It's actually finding out their hidden talent, identifying what they're good at, training them, and then encouraging them to deliver in the same way that anyone else would deliver. And there's no reason why they shouldn't have that opportunity. So for me, I'm a great fan of everything else that's happening, but disability really needs a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And I think, Emily, just to add on to what Hardeep said, it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
So maybe, the world as a whole started with gender because it was the first thing to address. But, as Hardeep says, absolutely need to look at every other form of visible and invisible diversity. One of the biggest conversations that's happening now is around cognitive diversity. How can you make sure different perspectives and opinions are being brought to the table in the right way? So I think it's about looking at every single one of these aspects, and only then are you really going to achieve the potential economically and creatively of what's out there for the world.
And if I could just add, Emily, I also would I encourage more conversation around some of these issues. So Emily mentioned that UK Research and Innovation has an external advisory group for equality, diversity, inclusion. And one of the things that we've done fairly recently was commission three bits of work. One was looking globally at bullying and harassment. We wanted to understand what that landscape looked like from research and innovation, from cross sectors. What are people putting together? What sort of interventions? What set of tools? What set of problems? But also to look at equality, diversity, inclusion quite broadly, and looking at it from an international perspective as well as in the UK. What teams are working? What's there? And one of the things that was stark that came out of, let's say, the international one was a lot of work on gender. And gender as a proxy for diversity. So when teams or companies or others were saying diversity, they meant gender, and they meant gender only, even though they were then broadening it out to want to talk about the various groups that they might be working with. And there was also a very strong sense that there's a lot of legal differences. So there are, I would imagine almost everyone on the stage knows this, there's particular countries and spaces, many of you might be from them, where it's illegal to actually gather information on particular people's characteristics, whether or not we're talking about religion or we're talking about race. So we can't actually take and export the ways that we might be monitoring or evaluating or assessing or gathering information and just take it to another context. Because in those contexts, whether or not we're talking about communities where there might be a large indigenous population or there might be a large Latino population, these differences matter. And when global teams come together, they actually present a very interesting, complex portrait in terms of what diversity looks like. So it will not be a one-size-fits-all solution or intervention. It'll actually need to be really quite context-driven, but also it could actually be adapted. But that will only happen the more we have global conversations about the sets of complexities and the reparative work that might need to happen. Hardeep was mentioning the work done on, essentially, people who identify as disabled as opposed to imagining that they are innovators in and of themselves. Well, that will have repercussions over time. So there may be actually places, I think, for companies and businesses to think about what relationships need to be repaired, as opposed to just inviting somebody to come in and they should wholesale just be willing to come. They might actually doubt that you mean it. They might actually not trust what you're selling. And they might actually have instances historically where somebody sold them a product or something else that didn't actually do any of the things that it said, or it hid its message. And I think that's the type of things that we can actually start having exchanges about, where we can then enable and help innovators who might want to go into, I don't know, Ethiopia or certain places and want to roll out a set of things, and it actually models past grievances or past sets of problems.
Can I just add to that for a moment? I think the point that we have to understand is this is a complex topic. And there is not one size fits all, but equally, we can't do one thing and then say, tick, done that. Exactly. There's been lots of talk about gender, so that's finished. Anyone who has operated in this space particularly, who's walked through the buildings and the offices of innovation companies, who's looked at financial investment, will know it's not tick, job finished. Job is barely started. But I think that what we need is a recognition of the change that needs to happen, the complexity of that, but also the benefits and advantages of that change and how to bring that on. We cannot skip from one group to another group and think that we are doing anything.
That's right.
What we're saying is there is an absolute need, particularly in this space, to address questions of diversity, but more importantly, inclusion of new thinking, of new people, of new ways of doing things. And that has to be done at multiple levels. At societal level, within the communities of the organizations that we're talking to, and at a personal level. We all walk around with our own embedded ways of thinking. And so we have to look at all three.
Can I just on that as well, I think it is really important that we are talking here about these diverse groups, and we can't segment them into silos. One of the big things that's coming from the work that we've been doing is the nature of intersectionality, that we're seeing this constantly coming up time and time again. And what that means that in terms of how innovation agencies need to kind of think about their programs, whether it's how a business might support this and try and advocate for this agenda, is to make sure that it is a person-centered approach that you've actually got here. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that we need a series of fragmented offerings that are going to be bespoke for everyone, but they need to be able to understand and see how they relate to this again and how they benefit. And that is in some ways about going out and talking and engaging with those groups, showing them the role models so they can see it if they're going to be it, is the phrase that is used a lot. When you think about the nature of the programs, it's not about simply doing huge programs that are kind of universal in nature, targeting one of these silos. But lots of these agile programs, there's lots of examples over on the other side of this building where talking to people, you can see they're piloting and pivoting ideas, this agile approach. As an entrepreneurship professor, I see and I research the idea of the kind of the quick change, the sprint, the agile business. But policy has an opportunity to do programs where they can intervene, we can test, we can pilot. And Innovate's done some great things in that space, as have others. And I think the Leaders Summit yesterday, again, talking to individuals there, this is the kind of the tone, this is what we need to be working towards.
Yeah, sort of the targeted approach is interesting, so we've had a number of successful campaigns and programs that have been very targeted. So we've shone a spotlight where we've seen that there's underrepresentation, and we've taken action to try and address that. And through our Women in Innovation campaign, the work that we've done there, we had some awards, and really we used the awards as a bit of a honeypot to attract in women who weren't engaging through our mainstream programs. And that was hugely successful. And actually, once you've attracted people in, you can then start to signpost them into the other opportunities. So that sort of targeted with the embedding approach alongside at the moment is the way that we're thinking about this. I want to go to one of the questions that's come through from the people in the room. So, what should global governments and policymakers do to support diversity and innovation other than hold lots and lots and lots of working groups and committees? i.e., just get on and do something, I think is the...
Yeah, well, actually, I'd like to pick that one up because I think it ties together quite a lot of what we've been saying. Although Tim's been talking about going out and talking to people, and we've been talking about, Laura has been talking about not doing a kind of siloed approach in terms of moving forward, and I've been talking about collaboration. I do think that it's really important that people don't just get seduced by action. And just think, just do anything, right? We have to do something because this is such an important issue. We need to seem like we're doing something, so we hold a session, we make a workshop, we make an action plan, we meet tomorrow, and then you think, look, we made everyone in our organization do this thing, it's so hard, but you've done absolutely nothing, right? You've not really transformed, because often what we're talking about is cultural transformation. We're talking organizational transformation. We might be talking about societal transformation. And it's really, I think it's important for groups to not imagine that an action plan or any key performance indicators or a 5-year, business case is going to solve racism or homophobia or transphobia or suddenly class dynamics. It's just a lot of responsibility to transform the world with an event. But I do think what we need to do is actually start harnessing the real creativity. Tim's mentioned about the agileness. We are not assessing our interventions. We're not doing really good, robust evaluations and talking about what is actually working and the limitations with what we know when we bundle interventions together to become 17 different sets of activities. Which one was it? Was it the first one? Was it the last one? Was it them all together? And we're seeing a lot of that in terms of companies and industries and organizations because they do it as this package, but they don't really know what works, especially if you want to then sell that to somebody else about picking it up or you want to transform systems. So if any policymakers are in the room, I would really significantly challenge you to figure out what interventions are you monitoring and keeping track of, what are you contributing to, and how are you assessing and evaluating them, and what's the evidence that's underneath them. Because there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of thought, there's a lot of things that we think we should be doing, but we really don't know what's underneath all of that in terms of what the evidence is. It's just an indication. And that may be places where there's gaps, and we could actually come together and actually start to put some robust information underneath some of that.
I think Laura wants to come in. Maybe.
Two things, yeah. First of all, and also because this is about culture and about human beings, when we're measuring, we have to recognize how dynamic this is. Yeah. So where we are moving things and making changes, those things we touch and we research, by that very effect, are changing, of course. Beware the backlash. Beware the change that you're not hoping to happen happens. And also, I think there's this point about bringing different voices and different people in the room. I mean, we started looking at, we created a group called the Global Innovation Coalition for Change. The UN's really good at big names. But what we said is we're not going to do this just with policymakers. We're not just going to do this with entrepreneurs. We're not just going to do this with investors. We need to bring everyone in the room to understand the impacts. And what we've said is we need to look at a number of areas in here. One being, okay, what could the standards be? What should the standards be versus what they are and where we might move them? What programs should be in place and how do we get those set up? And then finally, let's use piloting, right? I mean, let's use piloting to say what's working and quickly assess what's not working, or what is it within not working that didn't work, so that we can make those adjustments and change, and finally share it, communicate.
Yeah. I think we actually, we know what's not working, actually. I think to relate to what you said, I think that we know that bottom-up personal ideas of employees to bring some diversity into the company and create an event, a one-time event, that's not working. No. And it's even hurting the cause. And I think that programs are, I think if you're asking what the authorities should do, they should invest in programs and in strategic planning. And regarding to what you said before, in Israel, actually, you're not allowed to collect data on your employees' identities. There is one window of opportunity to do that, and this is actually, it's from a positive angle. You need to, if you're planning a diversity and inclusion program in the company, you need to approach the Equal Opportunities Authority and get their approval to collect data about your employees' identities. And of course, it's about, you need to collect data about how many and what types of people with disabilities you have. And most of them are unrecognized in the company. And in the area, I mean, most of the identities in Israel are quite easy to count. I mean, you can identify women and Arabs and people of Ethiopian descendants and people over 45 and sometimes people, but how do you count people who are ultra-Orthodox in Israel, which is a very specific group? Every question you ask in order to identify them will go into the deepest questions of, you can identify them according to where they live, or usually the best way is to analyze where their kids go to school, and this is something very delicate in Israel. And we're a very small community, 8 million people, with enormous clashes and cases in the area of diversity and inclusion, and we need to be very, very careful. And I also want to say that in Israel, we still speak in terms of siloed communities and identities, and I think that this is the wrong way to go about it. You do not speak about, if you continue to speak about women and Arabs and ultra-Orthodox, et cetera, you won't get into the deep importance of diversity and inclusion, and you won't create creativity. It doesn't work where you add 2 women, 3 Arabs, 4 people with disability, you mix and you get a wonderful stew. Usually it's a terrible, terrible stew. So the way, one final thing, I sit in a group of employers formed by the government, actually. The government formed, 2 years ago, they formed a group of employers, the largest companies in the Intel and Microsoft and et cetera. And we sit together trying to understand employers' role in creating diversity and inclusion and innovation. And our last conversation was 5 days ago. And it was about how to bring juniors into the tech industry. I'm mentioning it because we went back to talking about the juniors themselves, the people themselves, the diversified groups themselves, and again forgot to speak about who we are and how we, as you mentioned before, do something completely different and train ourselves in order to be able to bring in people who now most of the tech companies have no idea as to what to do with them.
Okay, great.
Emily,
Priya,
thank you. Just to address specifically the question of the role of government. So, as you know, I've worked in government before I moved to tech and investing, and I think governments can play a huge role in changing the style. If I can sort of broadly term that in 3 ways, I think it's market convening, market signaling, and market impact. Great examples of that, yesterday, market convening, President Macron has brought together 45 large tech companies, and they have all committed to bringing their boards to 30% gender diverse by 2022. It's a convening power of the government that forces that sort of change. Market signaling, that can be even sort of really small things, like government ministers or senior officials from governments refusing to participate in non-diverse events. Yes, that's a very superficial point, but it makes an impact. And then lastly, and perhaps the most important thing for me, is actually governments have a huge market power, not least because of the purchasing power they hold in all of our economies. So in the same way that, as we've done in the UK, governments have taken a leading role in bringing in smaller and medium-sized businesses into the procurement processes by forcing that to be a proportion of the procurement cycle, well, why can't we do that in the context of diversity? Why can't we make sure that governments are being the market leaders in terms of bringing in diverse businesses to their supply chains? Because actually, those diverse businesses need the opportunity to succeed in any way they can, and governments can really change the dial there.
And that is being done. I mean, some of that is being done, and I chaired a high-level panel that worked with one of the ministers. One of the outcomes was gender pay gap reporting, which caused an earthquake here. And it was simply because when things get measured, and people recognize how far away we are from where we're claiming to be, it created quite a shock, and the demands that we start to create that change were made.
But you measured the private market as well?
Yes, there was a new government
get to do that.
There was a new government regulation that at the time, any company with over 250 employees had to report the breakdown of their employees. And what that caused. And when we started doing that, we said, this isn't just to shame companies. In fact, this isn't to shame companies. And yet, when people started to look at it, they realized how bad the position was and started to look at the development of programs for change. And we're now, just as a heads up to all the small companies in this room, reporting is going further. and further, so that smaller companies as well need to report these figures. And it's partly because it's making yourselves as well as the public aware of where we are and reporting on that, and then working with them to create the change.
And not being afraid of that.
Yes.
And I think that's the thing, is that it's just telling you what you already know in terms of what your organization is. And I think just to pick up Priya's point, UK Research and Innovation has essentially more than 7,000 employees. So it's a business. Yes, it's a space where research and innovation happens. So the efforts that are happening within UK and research, UKRI, around commissioning research or stimulating various environments, working with partners, doing global stuff, is also something that UKRI is trying to own as an employer. And to recognize its business responsibility and its obligations to its employees, as well as leading by example to various partners. And some of that actually means paying attention to the structures. So we've talked a lot so far about individuals, bringing people in, stimulating folks, creating spaces. And I think one of the completely important aspects of equality, diversity, inclusion, or equity in various forms of this is to think about the structures that are in place within your organization or your business, the processes. We talked a little bit about procurement and supply chains, but there are things that may be actually creating impacts and effects simply by the way that you might hire people, or the way that you might recruit folks, or the way you might promote people, or the way you might move people through. And these are structural types of things, as opposed to a deficit an individual has that you need to then upskill or to be able to bring them into the organization, or you need a campaign to go and reach them. And there needs to be a lot more understanding of structural dynamics and sector dynamics, as opposed to necessarily thinking it's all about the person.
Galit, I know you want to come in. There's a question here that I want to ask. Can you bring it back up on the screen? Okay, so how do innovation agencies take this message and business benefits to the unconvinced at scale? We can end up talking to the converted and already active. So I think actually Hardeep said to me earlier, it's interesting to see who turns up to these sessions. You know, are we just talking to the people in the room who are already converts and are doing this anyway? If so, you know, it's a bit of a waste of our time, really, because you're doing it all already. You know, how can we get this message out at scale?
So one of the things that I think that we've talked about is obviously this idea of the importance of data, the importance of evidence, and as an academic, I'm not going to argue with that at all. I think the other side of it is that certainly my experience kind of working with government on a lot of these ideas is that there's often this kind of communications gap. We need to think about the awareness and how we put that message out there. So as well as kind of using things like the gender pay gap to highlight where the problem is, I think we need to be celebrating what works. We need to kind of be having those kind of flagships out there. We need to be telling people that this is an example of where diversity and inclusion has actually, like I say, created value, what the McKinsey report demonstrate, what some of the good evaluations of some of these programs help tell us. And I think that by doing that, what we're not saying is that diversity and inclusion is something you've got to do. What we're saying is that this is another aspect of excellence. This is another aspect of competitiveness. This is another aspect of growth. And if you engage in this, and we're showing, whether that's on the part of government, the innovation agency, businesses celebrating their own successes. I mean, this is what we want to achieve. We want to see scale-ups. We want to see growth. And if part of that story is the diversity and inclusion story, we shouldn't be selling the diversity story as a single story. It's part of that narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that sometimes when we kind of have these kind of debates, these workshops, these lots and lots of roundtables, we need to kind of make sure that we're mainstreaming this. This is part of a narrative.
Yeah.
This isn't the narrative.
Yeah.
I think that we're still in the stage that we need to work with the convinced ones.
Okay.
I think that diversity and inclusion is still viewed as that important issue. That we need to, everyone, you say diversity and inclusion, everyone goes, oh, yeah, it's important. No, it shouldn't be described as an important issue. It should be described as an innovation, an innovative tool, as something you have to infuse into the structure of the success you build for your company. That diversity and inclusion is a powerful tool for success.
So,
Hardeep, come in on this.
Sorry to interject.
it's all right. No.
Been dying to talk. I think I agree with a lot of what everybody said. I think from my point of view, as someone that's set up a business, an alignment to disability is a key criteria for anyone that's working with me. So they have to have an alignment to disability, full stop. And then as well as the other diverse initiatives, they're really important too. So I think actually there's a valuable 500 initiative that some of you may have heard about that was launched at Davos earlier this year by a lovely lady who is amazing called Caroline Casey. And actually this initiative is to encourage boards of all companies to put disability onto their agenda from 2019. So I spoke about entrepreneurship and role models. I think initiatives are also very important. They're actually real. And what Caroline does is when the CEO of a large company comes on board, they record a short video and say, this is actually why we've come on board with a valuable 500 initiative. So I think there's a very, very long way to go before we actually achieve real impact. I mean, I think one of the big issues is people with disabilities within organizations that are achieving and doing really well won't say they've got a disability because they're too scared that they might then be discriminated against. Yeah. So you actually have no way of measuring that. Yeah. And this is part of the challenge we feel, that it's great to have evidence and it's wonderful to have figures, but a lot of the time there are intangibles that you're not going to be able to measure.
Well, right? I will tell you that from a research perspective, you can. You just don't necessarily do self-disclosure. So I think the overemphasis of making people tell you stuff, and then when you have a certain number that you don't know, go, oh, I don't know. There may be other ways of ultimate, especially if you're thinking about it culturally. And I think that takes the pressure off of individuals. Yeah. And for us to overemphasize that as the only evidence that we have, right? And then that's where I'm thinking we can do a lot more creatively, methodologically, to really start to unpick and understand these sets of things. But I do want to go back to, I think, your point about, I just lost the thread quickly. Actually, it's going to pick up Priya's point.
I'm afraid that we have just about run out of time.
Oh.
I told you they were outspoken, so I knew this might happen. But so we are pretty much at the end of this session. But I would just like to give you all one last opportunity to give a message to the people in the room, a takeaway from this session. Should we start at that end, Hardeep?
I think my greatest lesson in life is never judge a book by its cover and give people with disabilities a chance to prove themselves.
Priya.
Diversity is good for innovation and it's good for business.
I'd say that everyone owns this agenda.
Be bold and get some help.
This isn't something that you need to think about or set up a single initiative for. This thinking has to be at the core of your organizations.
And don't just do one thing. I think if there's anything that we're talking about is to start to think about various levers and various campaigns and various ways, because even the people who are the active ones get tired. And they do. And so to not
overuse.
Yes, and to not necessarily deny the power of coming together.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you so much to this amazing panel.
Thank you.